Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio. The love story that couldn't survive fame. A love written in stardust. Some love stories begin quietly. A glance across a crowded room. A coincidence. A smile. But some love stories are born already wrapped in myth, under the bright and merciless lights of fame. This is one of those stories. She was Marilyn Monroe, the shimmering blonde goddess of Hollywood, the woman the world desired, photographed, worshipped, and misunderstood. He was Joe DiMaggio, one of America's greatest baseball legends, a man of discipline, silence, pride, and old-fashioned values. They came from different worlds. She belonged to the cinema, flashbulbs, and fantasy. He belonged to stadiums, routine, and a kind of masculinity that didn't ask for attention. It commanded respect without words. And yet, somehow they found each other. What followed was not a fairy tale. It was not the kind of romance that survives on glamour and magazine covers. It was passionate, troubled, deeply human, and heartbreakingly fragile. Because when love is placed between two people and millions of watching eyes, it often becomes something else. This is the story of Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio, a love that burned bright, broke fast, and somehow never truly died. The icon and the legend. By the early 1950s, Marilyn Monroe had become more than a rising actress. She was becoming a phenomenon. Her image was everywhere. Movie posters, magazine covers, gossip columns. To the world, she was sensuality itself, playful, irresistible, almost unreal. Men dreamed about her. Women studied her. Studios sold her as a fantasy. But behind that dazzling image was a woman carrying deep loneliness. Marilyn's childhood had been unstable and painful. She grew up with insecurity, abandonment, and the desperate need to be loved. The glamorous persona the world adored often hid a vulnerable woman who longed for safety and tenderness. Joe DiMaggio was different in almost every way. He was already an American hero, a New York Yankees legend, a man whose name carried power long before he ever met Marilyn. But Joe was private, reserved, controlled. He disliked spectacle. He distrusted Hollywood. He came from a traditional background and believed in loyalty, dignity, and quiet strength. It almost feels impossible that these two people would fall in love. But maybe that was exactly the reason they did. Marilyn saw in Joe something rare, stability. A man who wasn't impressed by studio games or celebrity culture. Someone solid. Someone serious. Someone who seemed to want her, not just Marilyn Monroe, the public fantasy. And Joe, perhaps, saw beneath the blonde bombshell image. He saw a softness in her, a sadness, a fragility, something worth protecting. That instinct to protect her would define their love, and in many ways help destroy it too. Their first encounter. The story of how they met already carries the kind of mythology only famous romances seem to acquire. Joe DiMaggio had reportedly seen a photograph of Marilyn and become intrigued, not just because she was beautiful, though of course she was, but because there was something magnetic about her, something vulnerable beneath the glamour. Eventually, they were introduced. When they met, sparks didn't explode in some grand cinematic way. It was subtler than that. Joe was not a man given to dramatic performances. And Marilyn, despite her public image, could be shy, uncertain, even anxious in private. Still, there was an attraction. He was captivated. She was charmed. Joe's seriousness set him apart from the polished, ambitious men of Hollywood. He was not trying to play a role. He was not trying to impress her with witty lines or industry connections. He had the weight of a real life behind him. Victories, discipline, a reputation earned the hard way. To Marilyn, that must have felt grounding. And to Joe, Marilyn was more than what the public believed. In private moments, she could be sweet, funny, insecure, eager to please, and desperate for genuine affection. Their courtship quickly drew public attention because of course it did. How could it not? America's most famous baseball hero and Hollywood's most desired star. It was irresistible to the press. The headlines practically wrote themselves. But while the public saw glamour, the private truth was more complicated. Joe wanted a wife. Marilyn wanted love. Neither fully understood what the other world required. Falling fast. Their romance moved quickly. For Marilyn, Joe may have seemed like the answer to a prayer she had whispered her whole life, someone to make me feel safe. Not adored by strangers. Not photographed. Safe. For Joe, Marilyn may have represented something equally powerful: tenderness, beauty, and a chance to build a life with someone he could love away from the noise. But from the beginning, there were warning signs. Joe did not like the way Marilyn's image was consumed by the public. He didn't like the pin-up photographs, the seductive persona, the crowds of men staring. He may have fallen in love with the woman behind the image, but the image was the very thing making her famous. And Marilyn could not simply step out of being Marilyn Monroe. That was the trap. Joe wanted to protect her from a world that was also the source of her power. Marilyn needed love, but she also needed her career, her independence, and the dream she had worked so hard to reach. This was never going to be easy. Still, love has a way of making impossible things feel temporary. Like obstacles can be solved later. Like passion alone will somehow be enough. And so they moved forward. Toward marriage. Toward hope. Toward the beautiful illusion that love could somehow silence everything else. Marriage in the spotlight. In January 1954, Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio were married. It should have been the beginning of their forever. And for a moment, maybe it felt that way. The wedding itself was surprisingly modest compared to the size of their fame. That says something important. Beneath all the headlines, this was not a couple chasing spectacle. Joe especially wanted privacy. He wanted a real marriage, not a public performance. But there was no such thing as privacy for Marilyn Monroe. Everywhere they went, the cameras followed. Every smile became a story. Every expression became evidence of happiness or trouble. They were not just husband and wife, they were symbols. And symbols are impossible to live up to. Marilyn tried to be the kind of wife Joe wanted. But she was still working, still filming, still trapped inside a Hollywood machine that sold her image as fantasy to the world. Joe struggled with that. He loved her. That part seems undeniable. But love mixed with possessiveness, fear, and discomfort can become dangerous. He wanted to shelter her from the eyes of others. Yet her entire identity, at least publicly, depended on being seen. He wanted Marilyn the woman. The world demanded Marilyn the dream. And Marilyn was being pulled apart between the two. The dress scene that changed everything. Every tragic love story seems to have a moment when the crack becomes visible. A single scene, a single humiliation, a single turning point. For Marilyn and Joe, that moment has become legendary. It happened during the filming of The 7-Year Itch, in the now iconic scene where Marilyn stands over a subway grate and her white dress billows upward in the air. Today, it's one of the most famous images in movie history. But for Joe DiMaggio, standing there and watching crowds gather, cameras flash, and strangers cheer as his wife's skirt flew up for public delight, it was unbearable. To the world, the moment was playful, glamorous, unforgettable. To Joe, it was humiliation. What people saw as Marilyn's brilliance, Joe saw as exposure. What Hollywood celebrated, he experienced as a kind of public violation, not only of her, but of their marriage. That night, the tension between them reportedly exploded. And maybe that was the moment the marriage truly ended. Because the issue was never just one dress, one scene, one crowd. It was everything that moment represented. Marilyn could not be who the world expected and who Joe wanted at the same time. And Joe could not accept the price of loving the most watched woman in America. The breaking point. Their marriage unraveled with painful speed. They had been married less than a year. That is one of the saddest details of all. A love so public. A union so celebrated. And yet, it collapsed almost as quickly as it began. Reports of jealousy, arguments, emotional strain, and controlling behavior surrounded the relationship. Marilyn was under immense pressure already, battling insecurity, professional demands, and a deep inner fragility. Joe, meanwhile, seemed increasingly unable to cope with the realities of her fame. Love alone could not save them. And perhaps the cruelest part is this: both of them may have loved sincerely. But sincere love is not always healthy love. And it is not always enough. In October 1954, Marilyn filed for divorce. The marriage had lasted only 9 months. 9 months. For a couple whose romance remains one of the most remembered in American celebrity history, that number feels almost unreal. But perhaps length is not what makes a love unforgettable. Sometimes it is intensity. Sometimes it is timing. Sometimes it is the unbearable feeling that, under different circumstances, things might have turned out differently. When they separated, the public saw failure. Another celebrity marriage gone wrong. Another beautiful illusion shattered. But beneath the headlines was something much sadder. Two people who could not make their worlds fit together. Two people who wanted something from love that the other could not fully give. After the divorce, love that refused to disappear. This is where their story becomes even more haunting. Because although the marriage ended, Joe DiMaggio never truly disappeared from Marilyn's life. And perhaps Marilyn never disappeared from his heart. They remained connected in ways that went beyond tabloid narratives. There were periods of distance, of course, but Joe continued to care for her. When Marilyn struggled later in life, emotionally, professionally, personally, Joe was still there in the background, not as a husband, but as something more complicated, a man who never stopped loving the version of her he believed he knew best. By then, Marilyn's life had become increasingly painful. She continued to rise as a cultural icon, but fame did not heal her. If anything, it magnified everything that hurt. Failed relationships, mental and emotional exhaustion, dependence on medication, the unbearable burden of being Marilyn Monroe every waking moment. Joe watched that from a distance. One of the most striking things about Joe DiMaggio is that, unlike many men attached to Marilyn's legend, he did not spend the rest of his life publicly exploiting their connection. He remained deeply private. In some ways, that privacy says more than any dramatic interview ever could. It suggests that whatever he felt was real. Real enough to keep sacred. Real enough not to turn into performance. There were even reports that, years later, they had grown close again and may have considered reconciliation. Whether or not that future was truly possible, the idea alone is heartbreaking, because it hints at the great question that follows so many tragic love stories. What if they had met at another time? What if she had been less famous? What if he had been less proud? What if they had both been just a little less wounded? Marilyn's final chapter. In August 1962, Marilyn Monroe died at only 36 years old. The news shocked the world. Even now, decades later, her death remains surrounded by sadness, speculation, and an almost unbearable sense of loss. She had become one of the most famous women on earth, but fame had not saved her from loneliness, fear, or pain. For Joe DiMaggio, her death was devastating. And here, perhaps, is the deepest proof of what she meant to him. He took charge of her funeral arrangements and reportedly kept certain Hollywood figures away, determined that in death she would not become one final spectacle. And then came the gesture that has become part of their legend. 4 years after Marilyn's death, Joe DiMaggio is said to have sent roses to her grave regularly. Not for publicity, not for applause, not for headlines, just roses, again and again. A ritual of grief, a private devotion to a woman he had loved, lost, and never fully let go. There is something profoundly moving in that image. Not the glamorous wedding photographs, not the flashing cameras, not the iconic white dress, but an aging man, quietly honoring the memory of the woman he could not save and could not forget. That is where their love story stops being celebrity gossip. That is where it becomes tragedy. Why their story still haunts us. Why do we still talk about Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio? Because theirs was not a perfect love story. It was a broken one. And broken love stories often stay with us longer than perfect ones. They remind us that love is not just attraction, not just timing, not just chemistry. It is compatibility, trust, freedom, tenderness, and the ability to let another person be fully themselves. Marilyn and Joe had passion. They had longing. They had tenderness. They had myth. But they did not have peace. She needed someone who could love her without trying to shrink her. He needed a world that made sense to his values. Neither one could bend enough without breaking. And yet, what makes their story unforgettable is that the love seems to have been real, even if it was flawed. Especially because it was flawed. In Marilyn, Joe may have seen the woman hidden beneath the symbol. In Joe, Marilyn may have seen the shelter she had searched for all her life. But sometimes love arrives carrying beautiful promises it cannot keep. And so their story remains suspended in time. The blonde star with sadness behind her smile. The baseball hero with love he did not know how to hold gently enough. A marriage that lasted months. A memory that lasted a lifetime. Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio did not get the ending people dream of. There was no peaceful growing old together. No final reconciliation worthy of Hollywood. No happy ever after. What they had was shorter, messier, and far more human. A love born between two legends. A marriage crushed by fame, pride, jealousy, and impossible expectations. And a grief so lasting that long after the world had moved on, one man still sent flowers to the grave of the woman he once called his wife. Maybe that is why their story still lingers. Because in the end, Marilyn and Joe were not just icons. They were two lonely people who found each other for one brief, dazzling, painful moment and never completely let go.